And then there were two potential smoking guns, two inside accounts from Trump allies, people in touch with both the White House and the Ukrainians, people who suspected that military aid for Ukraine had become tied to the Ukrainian government committing to conducting an investigation that would damage Donald Trump's political opponents. The first was U.S. diplomat Bill Taylor, who wrote this in an encrypted message that was made public by the congressional committees investigating the matter. Quote, "Are we now saying that security assistance and White House meeting are conditioned on investigations?" That same career diplomat, Bill Taylor, also wrote this, quote, "As I said on the phone, I think it's crazy to withhold security assistance for help with a political campaign." A Trump-appointed diplomat would respond with a CYA message disavowing him of that notion, but Taylor wasn't the only person who was starting to suspect that the president had tied military aid for a U.S. ally to investigations that would advance his political objectives. The second we're learning today was Republican Senator Ron Johnson, who told the Wall Street Journal he heard accounts of a potential quid pro quo from that Journal report. Quote, in an interview, Senator Ron Johnson said he learned of a potential quid pro quo from the U.S. ambassador to the EU, Gordon Sondland, who told him that aid to Ukraine was tied to the desire by Mr. Trump and his allies to have Kiev undertake investigations that the president has sought. That right there, the connection of military aid for Ukraine to Donald Trump's political operations is what lies at the center of this fast-moving scandal that has ensnared the president and his cabinet, including multiple diplomats. One such diplomat is former envoy to the Ukraine, Kurt Volker, who at this hour yesterday was behind closed doors in the first deposition of the House impeachment investigation. His 9.5 hours of testimony yielding a treasure trove of what may come to be known as the 2019 version of the Nixon tapes, encrypted messages and texts, including this one, which Volker sent to a Ukrainian official the morning of the July 25th phone call between Donald Trump and Ukraine that's at the center of the scandal. That message read, quote, "Heard from White House, assuming President Z convinces Trump he will investigate / quote, get to the bottom of what happened in 2016, we will nail down date for visit to Washington. Good luck. See you tomorrow, Kurt." Kurt Volker is also now reported to have engaged in highly questionable efforts to get the Ukrainians to play along with the president by releasing a statement committing to those political investigations the president was seeking. That is based on new reporting in the New York Times. All of this bursting into the open as Trump clings to his own personal reality, vehemently denying to reporters that there was a quid pro quo involved in his Ukraine policy, despite all this mounting evidence to the contrary. The president also insisting his message to Ukraine was all about corruption, not politics, though one key question from a reporter may have coaxed out a little bit of truth.
Have you asked foreign leaders for any corruption investigations that don't involve your political opponents? And are there other cases where
we would have to look?
That's where we start today with reporters on the front lines of this story. Washington correspondent for the New York Times, Mike Schmidt, senior writer for Politico, Jake Sherman, and NBC News correspondent Carol Lee, plus former federal prosecutor Paul Butler. Jake Sherman, let me start with you. One day, one witness, 9.5 hours, and the kind of text messages that pierce right through all the noise and all the smoke. A career diplomat putting into writing what is at the center of this whistleblower complaint, what is at the center of really the only unanswered question, which is whether or not there was a quid pro quo in writing understood by the people carrying out Donald Trump's Ukraine policy.
Someone made the point to me today, and I just was talking to my colleagues about this. Everything in politics is kind of a quid pro quo, so it doesn't actually need to be said, right? I mean, the president has immense power over Ukraine, whether it's machinery, weapons, whatever it is. It doesn't need to be said. That's one point of view. I just want to get back to what you said at the top there, which is these text messages and the subsequent reporting by Mike and others at multiple outlets shows that Donald Trump is using the machinery, the gears of the federal government to try to tear down Joe Biden and his son Hunter. The difference of opinion appears to be whether that's right or wrong, whether it's part of an effort to root out corruption. By the way, an effort that seems to have just started in recent months, has not been a underpinning of the president's foreign policy throughout the last couple months. Remember, he said in many cases it's not worth trying to change countries' behaviors. So this has not been behavior he's tried to change all along. And Democrats say what he's admitted to publicly is enough to impeach him. Now, we're seeing a lot of procedural arguments from Republicans. Today, the Inspector General for the intelligence community is still in a hearing. We're now going on about more than 6 hours with Republicans and Democrats. And I was just talking to a Democrat in the room who has said that Republicans have been complaining about what kind of questions and how many questions they could ask. And you see publicly Republicans are pushing for a vote on starting an impeachment inquiry, which isn't actually mandated, but they want to try to inject these kind of what Democrats consider to be tangential arguments into this, because in Democrats' view, they believe they're trying to obfuscate what's actually going on. So that's what's happening at this moment. And I think it's important to note, and it's very telling, that they've been in this hearing, which they expected to last 3 or 4 hours now, for twice as long in the Capitol basement in the middle of a recess with the person, the Inspector General, who arguably started this whole impeachment process.
Well, because you brought us there, let's stay there for a second, Jake. Yeah. Let's remind, there's so many new figures now sort of thrust into our living rooms. The person that's testifying on Capitol Hill today is the watchdog, the Inspector General for the intelligence community. The watchdog for the intelligence community was the one that actually received the whistleblower complaint and then took the substance of that complaint, which we've all seen now, those 7 pages, and went out and corroborated it, interviewed some of the whistleblower sources, and determined that the whistleblower complaint was both credible and urgent. Donald Trump seems to be doing his best to give it the same seal of approval by confessing to everything in the whistleblower account. But what did we understand, Democrats and Republicans, to be seeking from the watchdog, the Inspector General from the intelligence community today?
That's a very good question. 2 things. Both the substance of the complaint, they want to know more about what happened, who the whistleblower heard it from, so the substance, but also the process, how it was handled, whether that was proper or not. A Democrat literally just texted me from the hearing, presumably, someone who was in the hearing, who said, you have to be living on Fantasy Island to not be concerned with this. And they said that this person who was in the hearing said, their argument was strengthened for impeachment. More lines of defense were closed off. Now, you've seen Republicans make the argument that the whistleblower did not have firsthand knowledge, and now they're making the argument, this is a new argument that just came up today, that Adam Schiff, the chairman of the Intelligence Committee, is a material witness because the whistleblower talked to his staff before he went to the Inspector General. So trying to ensnare and call into question Adam Schiff's credibility in this manner, which is a relatively new line of inquiry for Republicans who are desperately trying to defend the president and undermine this probe, and basically, and also are not making any bones about it. They see their role on Capitol Hill in the House minority to protect the president, who they feel is under unfair incoming fire from Democrats, despite behind the scenes a lot of Republicans expressing increasing concern when they see those text messages and finding it hard to defend a president who has not offered a consistent line of defense this entire time.
Carol Lee, I know from my own career in Republican politics that when you got nada, when you've got nothing, when you've got zilch, when you got no facts and no substance, you attack the process, you attack the messengers. I haven't heard any substantive pushback on a single claim from this whistleblower complaint. I haven't even heard from the White House, other than the president characterizing it as a perfect call over and over again. I haven't heard a single fact pattern in dispute from this call with the Ukrainians, in which the Wall Street Journal has reported that Donald Trump 8 times asked the president of Ukraine to investigate the Bidens. We now have the envoy to Ukraine, Kurt Volker, who testified 9.5 hours yesterday, sharing text messages. We have Mike Schmidt's reporting last night in the New York Times that he and the ambassador to the EU drafted an elaborate statement that the president of Ukraine could put out to help cajole Donald Trump to actually ease the military aid to a U.S. ally to protect themselves from Russia? I mean, is there a single, am I missing, is there a single fact in dispute from Republicans or simply process?
Well, no, and you're also not hearing anything consistent coming out of the White House either. Arguably, the only consistent thing that they have had to say is that to corroborate a lot of the things that are out there from either the Whistle Report or great reporting like Mike's reporting and others, which is that, the president says his phone call was fine. There was nothing to see here. Everything he did was above board. And so then they're tearing down the process, just as you said. And, our reporting shows that there's just no strategy right now in the White House, not politically. There's sort of an emerging legal strategy that you're seeing where the White House is saying that they're not going to turn anything over unless Congress, unless the House takes a vote on an impeachment inquiry. And that's sort of designed to, according to people I've spoken with, to try to speed up the process, basically say, we're not giving you anything, you'll move ahead, and as early as December, this could be wrapped up, and then they have almost a year to fight in the political arena. But when you turn to the political arena, they're not really putting out any sort of consistent message there, and that's been frustrating to Republicans on the Hill, to people outside the White House who want to support the president. And so what our reporting shows is that there's an effort led by Jared Kushner and Mick Mulvaney, the acting chief of staff, to try to sort of carve out a messaging strategy that basically has a carve out for the president, because he can't be relied upon to put out a consistent message, and he's all over the place. You saw that with his comments yesterday on China, and then you saw him again today pivot to try to say that he was upholding his own constitutional duties to try to push for these sorts of investigation, and he really cares about corruption, not politics. And so they're just not relying on, banking that they can rely on him in any way to put forward a coherent message, and are trying to sort of work around that.
I mean, the lack of a coherent message would seem like, problem number 17 on their list. I mean, these text messages, which, people aren't going to know who Bill Taylor is. He happens to be one of our country's top diplomats on the ground in Ukraine. People aren't going to know who Gordon Sondland is, probably, but he was in receipt of some of those messages. But these exchanges are almost universal in their intent. And I want to read some of these to you, Carol Lee, and ask you what possible spin could be crafted to explain this away. Bill Taylor, the top American diplomat on the ground in Ukraine, writes, "Are we now saying that security assistance and White House meeting are conditioned on investigations?" That has now been repeated by the whistleblower. It's been repeated by the Wall Street Journal reporting that the president asked for those investigations 8 times. It's been repeated by everyone who has so far emerged as a witness in this early stage of the investigation.
Yeah, and, frankly, they don't have a good answer for that. And I think if you look at Senator's comments to the Wall Street Journal, there's some suggestion, there's a beginning of sort of cracks here, in part because what's coming out, and this is just what we know as of now, there's plenty more that could come out, and what's already out there is quite damaging. One of the other things, Nicolle, that I find striking about these text messages and other things that we've learned so far is that all of these people seemed aware in some respect of what the president was trying to do, and yet nobody came forward and said anything about this. It took this whistleblower report, one individual who had secondhand, as they have called it, knowledge, meaning he got it from other people who were very close to the situation, and filed a whistleblower report. And so you have to also wonder, how wide does this go? How many people were involved? I mean, and knew about this and didn't say anything.
Mike Schmidt, are you back with us?
I am.
You have done some reporting on what happened and what became public, a story that published about 3 hours before these text messages were released by the 3 House committees. And it certainly paints a scene of a very elaborate effort that was underway by diplomats whose motives may still be in question, but their actions are becoming very clear. And take us through what you learned Ambassador Volker was endeavoring to do with the president of Ukraine.
Well, what they were trying to do with this statement was essentially get around the president and Giuliani and satisfy them. They knew that if they wanted to sort of level set U.S. relations with Ukraine and help the Ukrainians and push back on the Russians, they needed to pacify Trump and Giuliani. And the only way to do that was to get the Ukrainians to make this commitment to essentially publicly lock themselves in to doing these investigations that they knew Trump and Giuliani wanted. And that's why they went about it. And they got themselves certainly caught up in all this and are now being forced to explain it. But they're essentially trying to work around the president to do traditional American diplomacy, something that Trump probably didn't want to be done or didn't care to be done, but they thought was important and were trying to accomplish.
Let me read a little bit from your story last night. Their work on the statement is new evidence of how Mr. Trump's fixation with conspiracy theories linked to Ukraine began driving senior diplomats to bend American foreign policy to the president's political agenda in the weeks after a July 25th call between the two leaders. Is it your understanding that these men believed that releasing that military aid was tied to that statement that you reported on, where they committed to the investigations?
We didn't report on, we don't have evidence that the aid was tied directly to the statement. There's been things that have come out about how the statement may have been tied to an Oval Office meeting. But what these diplomats were trying to do, or what they believed, was that Giuliani was poisoning Trump's mind about Ukraine, and they needed to try and sort of pacify Giuliani to try and make him think that Ukraine was dealing with the corruption, so he would stop whispering in Trump's ear, and Trump would stop throwing up all these different roadblocks to different things, including the most basic thing of sort of embracing Zelensky and having an Oval Office meeting with him. So they're trying to work within the contours of the situation they were in to make the traditional U.S.-Ukraine relationship work. And obviously we see what happened with that. The interesting thing about the statement, though, is that it's the Ukrainians who ultimately said, you know, we don't think this is a great idea. We don't want to get any more involved in U.S. politics. And that's one of the reasons why we never saw this statement come out.
You know, Paul Butler, that's an amazing sort of commentary. I mean, how bad are U.S. politics? They're so bad that it took the Ukrainians, who have a reputation around the world of corruption, to be a guardrail on Donald Trump's rampant corruption, on what Mike and his colleagues describe as a poisoned mind on the part of the American president. I mean, it really, you couldn't have made it up if you wanted to.
It's unbelievable. So Trump's corruption is a bridge too far, even for the Ukrainians. And again, we know the president's moves. He's faced so many credible allegations of corruption over the last 3 years of his presidency. We know how he responds. First, he says, I didn't do it. And then he says, well, maybe I did it, but it's not a crime. It's not illegal. And so here he said, first, there's no quid pro quo. And there's substantial evidence. These text messages are only the most recent. So part of it is what they say. When the ambassador literally says, I can't believe that we are conditioning our military aid to the Ukraine on helping the president's political campaign. And then there's the cover-up also in text. 5 hours later, the responding text, oh, the president never said that. And by the way, let's not do anything else by text. Let's take it off of a written record onto the phone. And the other point, though, Nicolle, is there's not a requirement that there be a quid pro quo in order for there to be a crime. So one example is solicitation of a foreign national to donate to help your campaign. All you have to do is ask. You don't have to say, I'm going to do this in advance. The law is that foreign nationals are not allowed to participate in our elections, including with campaigns. And more importantly, for impeachment, no quid pro quo is required. This kind of corruption, this selling the interest of the United States based on the president's own political campaigns, that's the classic high crime and misdemeanor. That's exactly the kind of abuse of office that the framers had in mind when they gave the House the power to impeach and the Senate the power to remove. So once again, the only question is, are there going to be 20 Republicans That's the number that's required to remove the president from office once he is impeached. Will there be 20 Republicans who are concerned enough about national security to do the right thing for this country?
Jake Sherman, I see you shaking your head. I'm guessing your answer is no, there aren't going to be. I'll let you answer that. But then could you also address whether or not Bill Taylor, this U.S. diplomat, who I think went on to write in more texts that were released that he would quit if it turned out that the military aid, Taylor, the nightmare is they give the interview and don't get the security assistance. The Russians love it, and I quit. This would seem like an important witness for the Democrats to have before their committees investigating this.
You'd have to assume that, yes, if they haven't been in touch with them, and I have no reporting to suggest they have, that they will. I mean, I understand you need 20. Could we name 4 that are going to vote against the president at this point? I mean, it's news when one comes out. I mean, Mitt Romney came out today and spoke out against the president, and it was big news. I don't see, at this point, I mean, we don't know what's going to come out next. I don't see any Senate Republicans more than, and I'm not even sure what Romney's going to do. So I don't see that at this point. I mean, breaking in the last hour or so is the Democratic committee sent a document request to Mike Pence, the vice president. So that's quite significant that they're burrowing in even further to the administration and seeking more documents. Now, the president has said it's up to the lawyers. They're going to decide whether we're going to fork over documents and participate in these investigations. But there's a lot of peril. The White House is really operating in a dangerous zone here because Democrats have said if they don't hand over documents, that's evidence enough for an article of impeachment, which was obviously an article of impeachment against Nixon, which was obstructing the work of Congress, the lawful work of Congress. So the White House is really operating in a tight space here. Doesn't have much. They have not signaled much room for maneuver.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.